interprets it. On one end of the spectrum, I tried to fit these across, but it wouldn't fit. So imagine this as horizontal rather than vertical. On one end of the spectrum is the real writer, whose motivations may or may not be available to the reading interpreters. This availability or unavailability, in most cases, is the origin of some versions of the intentional fallacy. Right? The intentional fallacy says that the author's intentions do not matter when you're interpreting a work. What matters is the interpretation that the reader gives. Its most famous formulation is given by Wimsatt and Beardsley in American literary studies. For example, how can we possibly know what Chaucer intended his works to mean? He has been dead for centuries. Try as we might, we cannot interview Chaucer. Next is the implied author, who is essentially a reconstruction of the real author based on his or her corpus of work and the socio-political context in which he or she wrote. In the center is the narrator, or persona in the case of poetry. This serves as the voice of a particular narrative position in one work by the author in question. So by reading many works by the same author and figuring out what their narrative voice is trying to comment on, you can then reconstruct the implied author. Now on the other side of this spectrum, below the narrator, we find the readers. The first reader is the ideal reader. And this reader is one who knows the socio-cultural background and can understand the context of a work, as well as all of the references to that context, and indeed to other literary works made by a particular text. Last, we have the real reader, the person sitting there reading the book in your classroom. This real reader's knowledge might not match that of the ideal reader. Now this is where careful attention to the linkage between politics and history on the one hand, and literary production on the other, is important for pedagogy. Now, by way of elaboration, I will look to 4 texts. Rabindranath Tagore's The Home in the World, Jack Kerouac's On the Road. You might have read On the Road? You guys familiar with On the Road? All right, excellent. You know what I'm talking about. Anita Desai's Fire on the Mountain, and Mohsen Hamid's Mothsmoke. Now, to begin with the allegorical interpretation suggested by the text in its socio-historical context, I'm going to look at 3 works. So this is where I see one way of interpreting text in an allegorical fashion that we have available to us. So we'll consider Tagore, Kerouac, and Desai. Now, Tagore's text practically begs to be read as a political allegory. Kerouac's text can be read as a political allegory if you know where to look and you're familiar with the background of post-war American society. And Anita Desai's, I claim, really does not ask to be read as a political allegory. Now, at this point, I'm going to put you guys on the spot, right? I'm going to ask my students from this semester for help. We've read Tagore's text, and we've also read Desai's text. So I'm going to ask them, what are the allegorical values of the principal characters, right? What's Nikhil's allegorical value? Yeah, okay.
He's peaceful, idealist resistance.
Yeah, right. Nikhil in Tagore is characterized as a very peaceful man, also a very idealistic man, and yet he is invested in the Swadeshi movement and resistance to British colonialism. Now, we've got Sandip on the other hand. Yeah, who's Sandip?
He's the violent, impassioned resistance.
Right, yeah, exactly. He's the violent, impassioned resistance. And through the way in which they characterize themselves through their first-person narration, and the way in which other characters characterize them, this is made abundantly clear in the text. The next principal character is Bimala. Who's Bimala? Yeah, who's Bimala?
Bimala, she represents the nation.
Yes, she represents the nation, right? Bengal in this case, right? We don't have the contemporary political borders of India as a nation state. So Bimala is Bengal, right? Excellent, good job, guys. See, they learned something. There's also another secondary character, Amulya, who represents the next generation of political activists. Right? And just as Bimala is supposed to come down on the side of either Sandip or Nikhil, so is Amulya in that instance. Now, it took a bit of time for the class to work out these allegorical values, although Julia spotted that Guatemala was supposed to be the nation like right off the bat. Very proud of you in that instance. So it did take a bit of time for us to work out the allegorical values for these characters, and that required filling in the students on the background of Shashi and resistance to colonial occupation, but not all that much, as there was some background knowledge on their part. And they approached the ideal reader in some respects. Now, this approaching the ideal reader but not exactly matching the ideal reader is not only true of post-colonial texts for Western students, nor of Western texts for non-Western students. For example, Jack Kerouac. Oh, sorry, let's take a ride. I forgot to advance the slide. Jack, you've aged. Here we go, Jack Kerouac. This is my favorite picture of Jack Kerouac with his little cuddly kitten, and most of the time you find him smoking excessively in pictures online. Jack Kerouac's On the Road, right? It is often seen in strictly libidinal terms by my American students. The principal characters travel back and forth across the country, they drink a lot, they do drugs, they have just sort of a wild time, right? And so most of my American students see this as a strictly libidinal text. It's a personal story. However, Dean Moriarty, right, the motivator, the person who gets all of the other characters to move across the country and go for kicks, as he calls it. Dean Moriarty's excessive sexuality can be read in terms of the post-war milieu where gender norms were related to a return to peacetime gendered labor expectations. Right, as you're probably familiar in the World War II period, we've got Rosie the Riveter, right? We can do it, we're strong. The men were off killing each other, so the women had to go into the factories and make the guns and the bombs that the men used to kill each other with. Now, when the war was over, you return back to this, to the pre-war gendered labor expectations. Men were expected to fulfill the role of the breadwinner for the American family, right? And this is where you get the beginnings of the nuclear family, when people move out to the suburbs and dad goes off to work and mom stays home and becomes the homemaker. Now, in that particular political context, anything less than working for a living and providing for a family was not seen as an economic failure, right? It was seen as a failure of masculinity. If you can't hold down a job, you're not a real man, right? Now, Dean and the other beat characters in this novel, they reject the consumerist lifestyle of this cycle of earning and spending and earning and spending and earning and spending. Now, that, in the particular context in which the novel was written, means that they are less than men, right? Not fully masculine. So Dean must make up for this perceived lack of masculinity by betting as many women as possible in the narrative. One of the key lines of the book is that for Dean, sex was the one and only holy thing in life, right? Now, thus, Dean becomes a type of allegorical figure for the embattled male who does not subscribe to the labor expectations of the post-war capitalist regime. Many students in the US have kind of an idea, but they don't know about 100% these expectations, and hence don't approach the text from the position of the ideal reader. This causes them to read the text exclusively in a libidinal fashion, right? Only literally, only that which is happening on the page, right? The excessive sexuality is open to them. So unpacking this idea of post-war masculinity and labor and the linkages between the two allows them to approach the ideal reader and read this traditionally libidinal text in a political, allegorical fashion. Now, oh, it's the mouse, it's not me. Okay. There we go, all right. Desai's novel is a bit more problematic in terms of its allegorical significance. Now, I'm going to ask my class for some help here, too. As a class, we decided that the strictly political interpretation is akin to trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It takes a lot of effort, but it really doesn't want to go in. Now, that does not mean that the novel has no allegorical value. It has meaning, but when read as an existential allegory. All right, class, we're going to go through the roll call of characters again. Right? Who's Nanda Kabul? Ready?
She represents alienation.
Yeah, alienation, right? In the novel, Nanda lives off on the Carignago on the top of a mountain. She is dreading the arrival of the postman, right? Because that means messages or news from the outside world are going to come in. She's often paralleled with imagery like a lonely pine tree, right? So alienation, existential separation and angst from that's caused by that separation. What about Braud?
She represents the search for meaning and the self.
Yeah, right, Braud. She goes off in search of adventures. She's also got some destructive qualities, right? At the end of the novel, she sets the forest on fire, burns it down, which represents destroying the old self or the old experience and establishing something new, right? So it's the quest for meaning for an individual life in an essentially meaningless world. Now lastly, we've got Allegory.
I would say that she represents like the struggle of the individual versus determinism.
Right, yeah, the individual versus determinism. Your life is sort of planned out for you in a way, and based on the society and the circumstances under which you were born. And this is very much the case with Allegory. Right, she is very headstrong. She continues to do her Christian missionary work, regardless of her economic situation. Right, she was from a rich family, and through the dissipation and excessive alcoholism of her brothers, she is brought down to the level of poverty. Right, but she still continues to struggle. So the struggle of the individual versus determinism is represented by Allegory. Now, Desai's novel does not suggest a strictly political allegory along the lines of Jameson's argument, but rather an existentialist allegory that's sort of keyed into human psychology. Now, that does not mean that politics is altogether absent from the novel. Right? At the novel's climax, and sorry to ruin it for you if you haven't read it yet, at the novel's climax, Allegory, who is a Christian, is murdered by a Hindu. The violent death of Allegory in this instance is clearly a socio-political reference to communal religious violence in India. Now, these three texts require elaboration of the socio-political background for some students, right? The significance of Allegory being murdered by someone of a different religion is lost on some students if they're not aware of the history of communal religious violence in the South Asian subcontinent. So this socio-political background is necessary, an education, if you will, in this socio-political background is necessary, especially when your students grow up in a different socio-political and cultural context. Now this points to the necessity of bridging the gap between the real reader and the ideal reader in pedagogical contexts, and illustrates the importance of historical and cultural instruction in addition to literary instruction, even or especially when the text suggests an allegory.